Hi, Daniel.
Hello.
Looks like I'm the only one. Yeah.
You are the only one here. We're a little bit early, but just be aware we are recording and we're actually streaming live to Facebook right now. So welcome to everybody.
Thank you.
And I'm just going to sit here for about 5 minutes and wait for people to arrive.
I'm
Go ahead.
joining this after a very long time. It used to be on Teams, so we're not doing it on Teams anymore. Is that correct?
Yeah, the Teams administrators, for whatever reason, whenever we try to have discussion groups, they would like boot everybody out of our group. And I contacted them. I got no explanation, no contact where I could follow up on. So the administrators, they were perfectly fine with us having meetings, but if we wanted to have any sort of discussions after the meetings, they weren't allowing people to join. So I switched over to Zoom.
So I have to do 2 registrations now. I have to hit an accept, get a link, and then go into Zoom and register again, correct?
Yeah. And if you wanted to, you could join through Facebook as well.
Okay.
And Zoom's actually the important one right now. I know a lot of people are, how do I say this delicately? It's a time where people may be transitioning from jobs and there's a lot of turnover. And so I want to make sure that this is still available for people if they leave Intel or if they retire. And so Zoom's going to be the place moving forward. There's Glenn.
Howdy.
Hello. Oh, actually, you know what? We aren't live on Facebook yet. I just have like the sample video stream going. How do I get here we go.
Okay, so our conversation was private.
Yeah. I hope so. I don't know. Facebook is, you would think it would be easy, but I have to go and enter RTSP streams and streaming keys and get the events to match up with the live video events. You create an event and then you create a live video and you attach the two and then you join them with streaming keys. It's really quite a pain in the neck. That probably went out live. Did it? No. And this is why I joined a little bit early to try and figure this out. I swear I had this figured out 2 weeks ago. How are you doing, Glenn? Oh, you're on mute. You're lunching.
I'm lunching, yeah. My end of lunch, your start of lunch.
Oh, what time? Oh, that's right. You're a time zone ahead now, aren't you?
Mm-hmm. I guess I don't know, it seems pretty turbulent times.
Right.
Unfortunately,
just a heads up, I think the Facebook stream will automatically go live at noon or 1 p.m. your time. So we've got 2 minutes before it does.
okay.
So what's turbulent?
Oh, I mean, it just seems to me like it's not. I suppose the engineer in me wants to see everything sort of cut and dry, and you know, finances are one of those things that are like that in my philosophical view. So revenue, expenses, income is fairly straightforward to calculate, and so when you have
It's everything else about a business that isn't.
yeah, so when things are still changing fairly fast and frequently in what should be a fairly straightforward set of equations, my head just kind of scratches, and then you just say, oh well, gosh, our revenue outlook is different, or interest rate assumptions were different, or whatever your business problem is at the moment seems to just keep adding more variables to a shaky base, and just have to keep going through it. I mean, this is like, I don't know, 7 or 8 times since I've been in Intel, we've been through one of these, fairly big cycles like this.
Hey, I just realized I'm not connected to the Intel VPN. So I'm going to connect really quickly. And hopefully I'll only be out for a few moments. Hey, Kurt, good to see you here. Here's our speaker.
Hi, how are you?
I'm going to disappear for 1 minute. I need to connect to the Intel VPN. I didn't realize I wasn't connected. So I will be right back.
Okay.
Hopefully, maybe it won't stop at all.
I was on a different Zoom last night, and when I did it, I had to drop and restart. So he looks frozen to me anyway. I love your background, Kurt. That's cool. I love the stone in the wood. That's awesome. You're on mute, by the way.
This is my first day using Zoom after 3 years. Yeah. Yeah, thank you. I live a little outside of Portland, kind of near the Clackamas River.
Oh, okay. Trees are abundant. Make use of them. Yep.
It's true.
And you got glacial soil, so there's all the rocks.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, it's great architecture. I love it.
Oh, thank you.
I have sand. It's not really architecturally that interesting.
All right. Interestingly enough, I could still see everybody through the Facebook live stream, even though I disconnected from Zoom. So welcome, everybody. This is our last real estate club meeting for the year. And I'm hoping that everybody here has a happy holidays, Merry Christmas, Happy Hanukkah, whatever holidays you celebrate, have a happy time. And we are going to get started in just about 5 minutes. We're going to let people join for a little bit. And then we're going to start with a couple of announcements. And I'll introduce Kurt then, who is a property manager here in the Portland area. And I'm sure you'll have a much better introduction than that to yourself, Kurt. But
that covers it.
definitely. What's that?
That covers it.
Yeah. Well, that's a lot when you start digging into it, especially in Portland. In fact, I'm a huge believer that in almost, unless you really know your local regulations well, it's very, very appropriate to have a property manager who does know them well and who could advise you on how to be compliant and stay compliant and avoid any sort of issues that may come up.
Yeah.
So we have 149 people that are registered. We tend to get about half of those joining the actual meeting. And we are, I think, live on Facebook. So we'll wait just a few minutes. In the meantime, I would love to hear from anybody who is interested in a new topic. We are getting lined up ATM funds. There have been a couple of people that are interested in learning about what a fund that buys ATMs and operates ATMs can do. There's also people coming up that are going to be talking about asset protection and how to set up legal structures that will protect you from lawsuits and from other sorts of liabilities. But if there are other topics that you'd like to hear about, please let me know in the chat or just shout them out right now while we're waiting for people to join. All right. Sounds like we've got a quiet group here. I am just going to wait a few more moments, and I'm trying to go live on Facebook. You would think Facebook would make this easy, but you have to create an event and then a live streaming event and then enter in an RTSP stream and a secret key, join them all together, and it seems to work about half the time. So I don't have the process down perfectly yet.
In the metaverse, though, there's multiple versions of you that do have live streaming running at the moment. So
Good luck to them. All right, let's get started here. And my apologies to people on Facebook. It's giving me a test video, but it's not giving me any go live. All right, so anyway, welcome everybody here. This is our very last meeting of the year. We're not going to have a meeting next week or the week of New Year's, and happy holidays to all of you. Just a few things to mention. The Facebook group, which is currently not getting a live stream. I want to encourage you guys to go over there and check it out. I know that there's a lot of turmoil and potential change going on. If people are moving to other jobs or retiring, I still want you to have access to this group. So feel free to go over to the Facebook group and check that out. Here is the link to it. I will drop it in the chat in just a few moments. But while that's going on, I want to introduce Kurt Lane. Kurt is you're the CEO and founder of Chroma Property Management in Portland. Is that right?
Yes, that's correct.
All right, and you're going to talk to us today about how investors can keep on top of local ordinances. And and I think I don't know if it's going to be all particular to Portland, but I think I'd love to hear some that's generally applicable anywhere, and details that are applicable here in Portland. Portland is the second largest, the group of people that are attending this meeting, the second largest amount of them are from the Portland area. Number one happens to be Folsom, California, but we've got a large number of Portlanders here.
Okay,
so
great.
Kurt, feel free to introduce yourself and take it away.
Okay, yeah, well, thank you so much, and thank you all for inviting me to give today's presentation. Let me just go ahead and share my screen with you. So I am going to be speaking, primarily about Portland and Oregon specific regulation today. I think, for those of you, obviously, that are not based in Portland, and, certainly for those of you in California, even if these applications don't apply, directly to you or to your experience in your specific location currently, I think it's really good to be mindful of a lot of this regulation, because what we've seen historically is that Portland in general, Portland specifically, and then Oregon in general, really leads the way nationally in, the creation of additional regulations that impact residential rental properties. For example, Oregon is the first state, or was the first state, with statewide rent control. That's now obviously in additional states. Portland was one of the first cities with sort of its specific version and form of citywide rent control. Oregon certainly led the way nationally in COVID specific regulation. So in terms of, stopping evictions, rental assistance, all these types of things, all this regulation, you see Oregon is really a leader, if that's, I think one way to describe it, nationally for all these regulations. So again, even if, these don't apply to specific markets you're looking at, I think they are generally good to be aware of. It's something that we see happening a lot, certainly on the West Coast, but in other places that you might be surprised to see this type of regulation popping up. So places like, Kansas City, where I'm from originally, there's a host of new regulations that have come on in the past couple of years. And you're just generally seeing a trend towards additional regulation that legislatures see as benefiting tenants as opposed to landlords. So just, generally speaking, it's good to be mindful of all this. So the regulation I'm going to be discussing specifically are things that really went into have really come on board in the last 5 years. I'm going to start by going back over the last 10 years, take a look at what happened in my market specifically, and hopefully provide a little backstory for why we do see this regulation. Oregon is one of the most heavily regulated rental markets in the country. There is a really strong emphasis on tenant rights. So having a firm understanding of the regulatory environment here is something that's really critical when considering an investment, and something that I talk to owners and investors on a daily basis about. So we're going to be covering 3 specific regulations. Number one Portland's citywide rent control ordinance. Number 2, Oregon statewide rent control law, and also some additional regulation around termination notices for no cause evictions. I'll talk about what no cause evictions are, how those work, how that's been more heavily regulated. And then lastly, I'm going to talk about some regulations that specifically deal with security deposits and how we have to screen tenants. Again, these are Portland and Oregon specific regulations, but we see these types of regulations popping up more and more. Security deposits especially have been, traditionally a fairly contentious side of interactions between landlords and tenants. There are some new players that are sort of, I guess, disrupting the way that security deposits are done. It's moving more towards an insurance type of model. So we can get into that a little bit. There are time for questions. So obviously you can either ask questions as we go or, feel free to hold those to the end. I'm fine with either of those. Just to give you a little background on myself, I own Chroma Property Management. We do single family and multi-unit property management around the Portland metro area. So we deal in, Multnomah County, Washington County, Clackamas County, the whole sort of metro. Prior to starting Chroma, I've been an investment property owner both in Portland and in Detroit, Michigan. So I really try and come at this from an owner's perspective in terms of, what are the things that we need to be mindful of? What are the things that are impacting owners? What are the sort of, concerns that a lot of owners face? So we manage a mix of single family, multi-unit up to about, 20 unit apartment complexes. Let's go ahead and jump right in. And again, any questions, feel free to ask as we go. So I just want to start by, by taking a little bit of a step back and taking a look at, how we got to this regulation in the first place. So in the last decade, and I'm going to be talking about some numbers that, are a little bit older now, but I hope you'll bear with me because they really inform a lot of the regulation that we've seen come into play from really 2018 onward. And there's, new regulation now that we're seeing really about on an annual basis. But the general trend is that, 4.5 trillion was spent on rental housing in the last decade. That's nearly 50% more than was spent in 2009. And by December 2019, median US rents rose to $1,600. So over the last decade, we certainly saw a really significant increase in not only the amount of money that was spent on rent, but also, sort of median rents rose, pretty significantly during that time period as well. We saw also really big jumps in 2020 and 2021. A lot of that had to do, especially in our market, for, I think, combination of impacts of the pandemic and then also a very active and very tight housing market, which obviously has an impact, especially on single family home rentals. If we look at Portland specifically, during that same period, so, last decade, Portland renters paid $41.1 billion in rent, with $4.7 billion spent in 2019. And again, that's a 50% increase in the total amount spent on rent. Now, that might seem like a large increase, and it is, but it was actually really on par with the national average and actually lower than we see in some other cities. So if we're looking at trends in cities with, relatively high livability ratings, these are obviously, in-demand places that people are wanting to move to. So places like Austin, Texas, Nashville, Denver. You can see that Portland actually lags comparison. So, for example, you see Nashville going up 83%, Denver going up 88%, and Austin rents nearly doubled to 92.6%. So what this shows is that Portland's experience wasn't unique, but the way that our city government responded to it was. And it's really, if we step back a little bit more and take a look at activity during the first half of the last decade, that we see a lot of the forces at play that really, I think, caused the city to move forward with this additional regulation. So specifically in Portland, 2010 to 2015, rents in the Portland metro area, they rose 20.45%. That was the sixth fastest rise in the country. During that same time, though, income for Portland area renters aged 25 to 44 rose 19.53%. So, for this obviously kind of limited but very important demographic of the renter market, we see real income keeping pace with rents over that part of the decade. And just to put that in a little more context, Portland enjoyed a 19% increase in household income from 2005 to 2018. That was the fourth fastest rise in the US, and only San Francisco, San Jose, and Seattle grew faster. So what we can see then is obviously a larger geographical area, what can largely be defined as the Pacific Northwest, that saw some of the greatest, increase in real income over a really extended period of time from 2005 to 2018. In 2015 and 16, though, we saw a pretty significant spike in rents, again in Portland. So rents went up 11%, while income grew only 4%. And I'd argue it's really this 2-year spike that finally caused the city to act, and I think they saw, from their perspective, there became a much more acute housing crisis. Essentially, I think my take on things is that, and as you can see from the data, really Portland was the last inexpensive city on the West Coast, and it underwent a market correction that really wasn't outside of other national trends, and in a lot of ways was much lower than jumps in rent we saw in other cities. We also see really significant rental inventory being taken up by short-term rentals. That's something that happened during this time period in every other market, but it's not even sort of the core amount of units that are coming out of rental inventory. I think in Portland, the estimate's somewhere around, I think a little over 3,000 permits were pulled for short-term rentals during this period of time. But it's really the makeup of this, what used to be, rental housing stock. So it was typically, mid to higher end single-family homes, condos, townhomes that are closer in and really make up, a core of what would be our, sort of lower class B and possibly even class A types of properties. So it's not, significant when we look at the total amount of rental inventory in the metro area, but as a specific subset of the rental market here, it does have a pretty big impact. I think fundamentally, though, the city really didn't see or wasn't really interested in these larger trends at play. I think they saw this really as rising rents connected to issues of homelessness, and larger trends of redevelopment in inner Northeast and Southeast Portland. So over the same period of time, you see a lot of new construction, you see a lot of what's traditionally defined as gentrification, you see a lot of turnover of communities that were historically living in certain parts of the city. And I think what the city tried to do from a government perspective and a regulatory perspective was put a limit on some of these increases they saw as out of control. So that's quite a bit of backstory. I think it is important to contextualize some of these forces at play. One other impact or one other outcome of Portland being a high demand market is a significant drop in local investment in rental properties. So if we look at total sales volume, and this is again 2016 to 2020, 54% of investment apartment buyers in Oregon are actually from or based in California. 11% are from Washington. You see Illinois and New York make up pretty significant percentages. And importantly, only 16% of investment apartment buyers in Oregon are actually from Oregon. Also, importantly, many of the firms buying up are large institutional investors, such as Magnolia Capital and the Blackstone Group. What this is a general, larger trend is really sort of, smaller individual investors being priced out of transactions. In Portland now, a fourplex that in, say 2014 would have been, 250,000 is now probably, 1.1 to 1.2 million. So, what was traditionally a good sort of starting point for an individual investor in terms of, a first property or something early in their portfolio is now beyond the reach of a lot of your sort of, retail investors. And so you really see that reflected in the amount of money that's coming in out of state, and then the type of, organizations that are taking part in these transactions. So given all that, I want to jump into the specific regulation. This really goes back to a change in Portland City Code in 2015. And again, I'm going to be getting into some things that are very specific to the market that I operate in. Again, I would just like to remind everyone that I do think a lot of this is the type of regulation you're going to see in other markets, maybe not in all states, but certainly if you're based in California, you're very familiar with this type of regulation, and you'll probably see more of it. So this really goes back to, though, in November 2015, the Portland City Council updated the city code with this, kind of very interesting, I guess, new way of understanding how housing should be essentially, guaranteed in the city. And it's really this term reasonable certainty that becomes very important. So they want to see reasonable certainty in housing, whether publicly assisted or on the private market. This policy arose from a housing emergency that was declared earlier in 2015. That's now been extended through March of 2025. So we find ourselves really in a permanent state of a housing emergency. And as a result of that, the city council here really, passed regulations that's pretty significantly redefined the relationship between landlords and tenants. And the first one is, one of the really first examples we see of limiting rent increases. So this kind of goes beyond just a traditional, kind of rent increase or housing stabilization, and really pushes it a step further. So these rental protections that came on board, they were made permanent in March 2018, and now they're really a permanent part of our mix of regulation. And essentially what it does is it comes up with this idea of rental relocation assistance. And rental relocation assistance forces landlords to pay housing assistance via direct cash payments in the event of a no-cause eviction or a rent increase above 9.9%. So what it does is it does two things. Number one, it effectively caps rent increases annually at 9.9%. And number two, it gives tenants recourse financially if they are subject to a no-cause eviction. For those of you who aren't as familiar with how things work in the residential rental world, a no-cause eviction is essentially an eviction that happens through no fault of the tenant. So traditionally, that's things like a property being sold, a property being renovated, the owner moving back into the property. It's all the things that come into play that would cause a tenant to move out, even if they haven't done anything that violates the terms of the lease. So that's compared against, say, a for-cause eviction. A for-cause eviction obviously is things like an eviction due to non-payment of rent, for damaging the property, criminal behavior, all those types of things that are a result of specific tenant actions. So with this, we see rental relocation assistance that's based specifically on the number of bedrooms, and that's sort of the thresholds that determine the dollar amounts that tenants are eligible to receive. As you can see, it's pretty significant amounts of money. There are also penalties if the landlord fails to comply. So if they fail to comply, they're liable for 3 times the monthly rent, plus actual damages, attorney's fees and costs, and they still have to pay the rental relocation assistance. So just to put that into perspective, if you owned a 3-bedroom home that's renting for $2,500, in the event of a misinterpretation of the law or of not giving notice correctly, the landlord in those cases is liable to pay $7,500 in rent, $4,500 in relocation assistance, plus attorney's fees and damages. So you see really significant penalties associated with this regulation. That's one of the things that really, goes through all the regulations I'm going to be discussing. There's pretty significant financial penalties, both at the city and the state level, for any type of, misinterpretation of the law, any challenge that a tenant makes. So again, you see pretty robust tenant protections in all these cases. Now, there are some exemptions to rental relocation assistance, and this is something that, again, is specific to Portland, but I think is interesting in that it really speaks to the creation of a new, class or type of rental property. So the most common exemptions are for owner-occupied duplexes and ADUs where the owner lives in the primary residence. Now, there's a whole process in Portland where the owner has to qualify for this exemption through the Housing Bureau. They have to then provide notice to the tenants that they have it. We do a lot of sort of planning on our end when we're working with new owners to determine if any of these exemptions apply to them. If so, what that process looks like. We help them assist with that process. But the main thing to know here is that there are exemptions, and that specifically the city is making allowances for people in owner-occupied duplexes and ADUs where the owner occupies the primary dwelling. ADU, for those of you who aren't in Portland or in Oregon, means accessory dwelling unit. Traditionally, that's what would be called a mother-in-law's apartment. It's an additional sort of dwelling on the property that can be rented out to a third party. So because of that, though, the city is trying to give those owners a little more protection and a little more leeway to determine who's living at the property, and not to be as I think impacted by the financial aspects of this regulation. So the Portland regulation and the Portland rent control comes first. And this is, again, something that we see not only in our market, but also I think in other markets across the country, where you see cities and municipalities being very proactive in a lot of this regulation, and really, I think, forcing the hand of state legislatures to, I think, to try and reassert their authority, and to try and bring this regulation in line with what they want to see happen at the statewide level. So that's certainly what happened in Oregon. So after the passage of Portland citywide rent control, you see the Oregon legislature decide to act. So they came up again with the first statewide rent control. It's known as Senate Bill 608. This went into effect in February 2019, and it deals with rent increases, and it also deals with termination notices and no-cause evictions. What it does essentially is it caps the yearly increase at 7% plus the consumer price index. And this applies to all residential rentals in the entire state. The maximum allowable rent increase for this year, for 2022, was 9.9%. For 2023, it jumps to 14.6%. So I think one of the unintended consequences here, one of the things that the legislature didn't really foresee, was a sort of very inflationary environment. So I think from the state's perspective, they expected these inflation to typically be 2 to 4% annually, and not to see a big jump year over year in what the maximum allowable rent increase is. Obviously, the CPI went up a lot. And so now in 2023, it's jumping to 14.6%. So there has been some talk even in amending this regulation to sort of cap what the total percentage increase could be year over year if we continue to have inflation that's ongoing and not transitory. One important exemption here is for new construction. It applies for 15 years after the certificate of occupancy was granted. So that applies retroactively. That's something that's good to know if you're involved in a new rental construction development. You are exempted from statewide rent control. The other main thing that it does here is it pushes out the notice period for rent increases. So again, all of these things have to do with giving the tenants, I think, the idea is giving them more stability, giving them more time to make decisions if they want to stay in a unit, and giving them a little more, awareness into what their rights are with this entirely new regulatory regime.
Kurt, I have a question here.
Sure.
So you spoke about capping. Is the capping looking to happen soon or later? Because state of Portland is 10%, 9.9. But anybody else in Washington County can go up to 14.3 next year. So you said there's been talk about capping that too. So do you have anything to say for that? Is the caps is it happening next year or sooner than later? Or is there going to be a vote on it?
Yeah, I think it remains to be seen. I mean, I think when the legislature will go back in session, from what I've heard, it will be one of the things up for discussion and consideration. At this time, though, there's no plan to change, to move away from how it works currently, which is it's 7% plus the CPI. So yeah, it remains to be seen whether they will amend that. But when this number came out, the 14.6%, it was I mean, it was shocking. It shouldn't have been shocking, I think, to all of us who have been aware of what, year-over-year inflation has done in the last, in the last year or two. But it was, I think, very surprising. And I think one of the things that happens is people immediately come out and say, oh, well, rents across the board are going to go up 14.6% this year. That's not the case. I think, traditionally, or what we're finding and what some of the research is showing is that the average annual rent increase is right around 5%. That's certainly in line with, what I see in my business, especially if you have properties that are already, at the market rate. A lot of people aren't raising rents 14.6%. I think one other thing I want to just clarify here is, and it's a point that you brought up as well, is in Portland, the rate is 19.9%. I'm sorry, is 9.9%. In Oregon, so Washington County, anywhere outside of the city of Portland, it's 14.6%. The thing to know really with all this regulation is it's, whatever the sort of most restrictive regulation applies to where you're located. So although it's a higher rate outside of Portland, within Portland, you still always have to follow the 9.9%. Where this becomes a little tricky is in 2021, the statewide rate was 9.2%. So in Portland, even though the citywide rent control is 9.9%, the most you could raise it was the state level of 9.2%. So each year, landlords have to be very mindful of what the caps are, where their property is located, and which of these rates will apply to them each year.
Can I ask one more question
Sure.
very quickly? So, see, I'm a small landlord. You put a graph there that said 16% are in Oregon, big companies are buying. It's getting harder for smaller landlords to survive with these kind of rules. Like, I have a property which is a 3-bedroom. Normal, if I put it on the market today, it's $3,000, but I'm getting $2,200 on it. And I can't increase it. But I'm not looking to increase it either. I've always increased it from 3 to 4% since I've had the property. But cost of keeping the home has increased. If I call an electrician, it's $300, even if he just visits the home.
Sure.
Or things like that. Yeah. So where is the landlord taken into consideration when they make these ordinances? How are we protected?
Yeah, I mean, I think that's one of the issues here is I think that you have a situation where politically, I guess what could be called the landlord lobby has very little sway at the at a local or the statewide level. There's certainly organizations like Oregon Rental Housing Alliance, Oregon Realtors, Multifamily Northwest, and I'm actively involved in all these organizations that are out there and trying to do advocacy both for larger landlords, but then certainly for smaller landlords and for people that own one property or a couple properties. I think what we've seen though is certainly at the city level in Portland, but also at the statewide level, there's very few allowances that are made for people that are just individual landlords, which is, as we know, by and large the largest percentage of landlords in the country. I mean, if I look at just the properties we manage, I'd say it's the vast majority. I'd say over 90% of our owners own one rental property. We certainly work with people that are larger sort of have larger family holdings and we get involved with larger institutional investors and people who are overseas investors as well, and certainly out-of-state investors. But by and large, the biggest percentage of folks are people like yourself who own a rental property or a couple rental properties. I think sort of one very interesting thing, and I'll touch on this at the end, but a study was done after all this regulation came on board, and there's been a decrease in a little over 6,400 single-family rental homes in the 3-county metro area from 2017 to 2020. So that's a really big decrease in, and that's just single-family homes. That's a really big decrease in the number of single-family homes that are available for rentals. And I think it's a combination of things. I mean, number one, we obviously have had a housing market that's been, very strong, and a good time for a lot of folks to exit from an investment. We also, and typically in our market, and this is certainly anecdotally what I see with the owners that I work with, anytime a property is sold that's a rental in a single family home, the buyers by and large are going to be moving in as their primary residence. So that's going off the rental market. It's pretty rare that we see rentals that are sold as single family homes and stay as rentals. I think the second main driver though is a lot of this regulation we're discussing. I mean, I talk to a lot of people that, are individual owners. They've been managing themselves, and they sort of feel like they have one of two options because of all this regulation. Number one, they can hire a property manager to sort of handle and deal with this on their behalf, or number two, they can decide to sell. So yeah, I think I think the larger point is that there's been very little thought given to smaller individual landlords, and I think there's this just general idea that all landlords are large, they're all corporations or part of syndicates, and they're not impacted by this regulation, when the reality is certainly the opposite of that.
I have a question in that scenario. If someone like the previous person that spoke had taken the property off the market, maybe had family move into the property for a year or some period of time, and then they went to put it back on the market later, it's been more than a year, could then they reset the rent at the market rate?
Sure, absolutely. Yeah. So the thing to know here, and to clarify on all this, is anytime you're starting a new lease, so anytime a tenant moves out and you have new tenants move in, you can reset the rent to whatever market rate you want. So that's really common to do as well. And that's something that we get involved in a lot of larger renovation and capital improvement and remodeling projects for properties that we manage. And so it's not uncommon for an investor to buy a property, to legally issue a no-cause eviction. So the tenants move out, they then renovate the property, and then once the property is renovated, ready to go, then we'll just reset the rent at whatever the market rate is for that.
But you still have to pay the relocation, right? The $4,500 or something. If it's
Yeah, if you're in Portland, you do. Yeah, outside of Portland, you don't. But yes, if you are in Portland, you do.
Thank you for that clarification.
Sure, and that actually just ties into this idea of termination notices. So this again is part of what was SB 608, which again is the Oregon statewide rent control bill. One of the things it does is clarifies sort of the grounds for a termination. The first thing it does is basically specifies that in a fixed term lease, there's no grounds for termination without cause during the first year. And in a month-to-month lease, a landlord can only terminate tenancy without cause with a qualifying reason, and that the notice period is 90 days. So what this means essentially is, traditionally in rental leasing, we'll start with a 12-month fixed term lease. Historically, landlords are looking to re-sign tenants to another 12-month lease to try and lock them in for another year. This has kind of changed the arithmetic on that, especially in Portland. So a lot of times in Portland now, if we're managing single family homes, after the first year, we'll let the lease run month to month, because that gives the owner the most amount of flexibility if they want to sell it, if they are moving back into it, if they're going to be renovating it, all those types of things. So we have to really be mindful of where we're at in the lease and what's going to be happening with the property. And that then ties to these what are known as qualifying reasons for terminating a lease. So these are the reasons, again, that we can utilize to do a no-cause eviction. The main sort of takeaway here is that the common thread is the property won't be used for rental purposes for the foreseeable future. So essentially, the state's making allowances for properties really coming off the rental market. So it's, again, things like undertaking major repairs or renovations. The landlord is moving back into the property. The landlord has an accepted offer to purchase the building. With this last one, the very important word here is accepted. The important term is accepted offer. So you can't just evict tenants, preemptively because you're intending to sell the property. you have to actually wait until you have an accepted offer before you issue this termination notice. And the notice period now for all of these is 90 days. I mean, technically it's 92 or 94 days because you can't count the day it goes into effect and you can't count the day it's served. But for shorthand, we say 90 days. The reason that they like to see an accepted offer, and I think sort of the logic of the state with this is that you don't know the intent of the buyer until you actually have the offer. So if it's another investor, that's great. They'd probably love to have tenants in place. They want to just take over that lease and run from there. Obviously, if you have people who intend to move into the property, then you have to get into the process of going through that eviction. Again, this is something that we work on. It's really common. I'd say we are involved in, I don't know, half dozen of these every year for properties that are being bought or being sold, and sort of navigating and working through this process. So it requires a lot more planning. Obviously, it requires a longer closing period. It's something that I think the realtors that I speak with and that we work with, they're generally aware of, but it's certainly something that you want to be mindful of if you're looking at properties, or if you're thinking of selling your property at any point, to know kind of where you're at with all these qualifying reasons.
Hey, we have a couple of questions on the chat, if this is a good time for them.
Yeah, that's great.
Okay, Ashish is asking specifically, do you happen to know the percentage of rental properties that are owned by large institutions versus smaller investors? Is that a stat that you have a ballpark on?
I don't. I mean, I would say, and I don't want to just give numbers that aren't accurate here. I know that for single family homes, by and large, and I'd say it's probably, I want to say it's somewhere between 80 or 90%, which I know is a big difference, but are folks that own just one property in one rental. So, and those numbers change dramatically as you move into multifamily. So I think
I'm sorry, I didn't mean to say apartments. I meant rental units or rental houses.
Yeah, so rental houses, I would say it's probably, it's somewhere north of 80% are owned by individual owners. And that's certainly the makeup of people that we manage for.
Okay. And then his second question is, how do these strict controls affect your tenant approval process?
Yeah, that's something that actually we'll touch on a little bit. It has a pretty, it becomes very important. And first in Portland, and now in Oregon generally, we have sort of very clear screening criteria for how we have to evaluate applicants. And that's, I think, one of the big roles that property managers begin to play in all this. And not to say that individual owners can't do this by themselves, of course they can, but I think just we have access to systems that allow us to do a very rigorous tenant screening. So as part of our application process, everyone goes through, we do income verification. Everyone goes through a full background check. So we have a direct integration with TransUnion. So we get a full soft credit report. We get access to state and federal criminal databases. We also get access to a nationwide eviction database. We work with this company called Find Digs that handles our application process. And they have a lot of great integrations with payroll processors and also, can sort of do direct authentication through Stripe for people's, they can authenticate their bank essentially through there. So we get, in addition to sort of, your traditional paper copies of bank statements, we get, kind of real-time access to all of that information, all the payroll information. So we can do a really good job up front of knowing if the person qualifies financially. We then get a lot of background information to sort of, be able to tell it from a credit standpoint or from a criminal history standpoint if they're going to be a good fit. And then lastly, we still do a full landlord verification. So we speak with their landlord, make sure we know who they are, that they've paid rent, that there haven't been any issues, all those types of things. So it's really it's really a very formal process now that we go through to qualify applicants. And certainly that's something that anyone can do. I think it's just, again, larger, property managers and larger landlords have a bit of a competitive advantage there because we do have access to slightly different systems than, say, an individual landlord would. But again, it all ties back to this idea of a city and now statewide screening criteria that really looks at how we can and can't evaluate applicants. So it goes well beyond what are traditionally, considered protected classes, things that are covered under the Fair Housing Act. And now it has to deal with, the amount of income that people have to have, what their credit score needs to be, what the specifics of criminal history might be, all those types of things.
I have a question
Thank
here.
you.
So I've heard that if you get one application on Monday and then on Tuesday, a second one, and on Wednesday, the third one, and you run all three of them and you find the Wednesday one better, I mean, based on the information, but you still have to choose the Monday's applicant if he meets the minimum criteria.
So
Is that true? Yeah.
in Portland, that's true. So in Portland, and let me just pull this slide up because it will help sort of with this conversation. So there's two ordinances that are called the Fair Ordinances. These are, again, Portland specific regulations, but now we've seen them bleed over into Oregon as well. So Oregon's screening criteria is coming on board early next year, and so it will apply across the whole state. So one of the things with the screening criteria that's specific to Portland is we have what's called now an open application period. And the way that works is we have to wait 72 hours between when we list a property for rent and when we can start accepting applications. And people then are given, so our leasing agent provides people with information on when specifically they can apply. So we use those 72 hours to show the property, to line people up, to find out who's interested, and to sort of set people up to actually apply. The idea is then, and this is what happens in reality too, is that especially for an in-demand property, we'll see 10 or 15 applications, especially during the summer, all come in at exactly the same time. What we have to do then is we have to evaluate and approve or deny those applications in the order in which they're received. So if we have 10 applications, we have to go off of the one that was first. And if that person is approved, so if they meet the screening criteria, then they have to be approved and given the opportunity to move forward with the lease. If you're outside of Portland, that doesn't apply to you. So we manage a lot of properties in Hillsborough, Beaverton, Lake Oswego, Happy Valley. For those of you who don't live in the Portland area, I apologize for giving all these these names, but basically all these other towns and cities and communities that make up the metro area. Those places, you still are able to evaluate multiple applications, and you don't have to accept them in the order in which they're received. So you do have some more leeway. If you have a property, say in Beaverton, you don't have to follow this open application period and this very, sort of rigid way of processing applications.
But it's changing, you said, next year.
Well, the part the part that's changing specifically for Oregon is the screening criteria. And to be very specific, it's how we evaluate people with a criminal background. So in Portland, for example, you can't consider felony convictions more than 7 years after the date of sentencing, and you can't consider crimes for which an applicant was charged but not convicted. So some of those same things are what's going to be coming on board for Oregon as well. So what they're really trying to do is obviously they're trying to remove any crimes that have been decriminalized. So obviously a lot of drug sentences, things like that, those become no longer valid reasons for denying a applicant. And then also if you have a felony conviction that's more than 7 years after the date of sentencing, you can't consider it. Now there are some exceptions to that, dependent on the type of crime that it was, but by and large, what they're really trying to do is enable people with a criminal background and a conviction to eventually be able to re-enter the rental market and not be sort of discriminated against. There are some exemptions to that. So people that own ADUs, people with owner occupied, where you're going to be sharing the space with people, you're exempted from some of that regulation. But yeah, in general, a lot of this screening at the statewide level has to do with how they're considering a criminal past. And let's see, I think we have a couple more questions. I think there's one sort of talking about, let me just find it here. Jeff Merkley's new bill that finds investors that buy greater than 100 single family homes. What impact would that have on home prices where there'll be a mass exodus for large investors? Yeah, that's not something that I'm not actually familiar with that bill yet. You know, I'd say that generally speaking, it's fairly rare. I mean, we certainly do see it, but it's fairly rare in our market to have a lot of large investors with single family home portfolios of that size. I think, you know, in the past that wasn't the case, but I think you saw a lot of those people, you know, cashing out and divesting, you know, 10, 20 years ago. You know, certainly I do know some people that have, you know, fairly sizable portfolios of single family homes that are, you know, 30, 40 plus units like that. I think by and large, though, you see more investors, large investors in multifamily. I think in general, because of all this regulation, I mean, for better or for worse, you don't see a lot of appetite of some of the larger, you know, institutional investors looking to operate in Portland. I certainly see that in my world. I mean, there's been a big influx of private equity and VC money come into property management over the last really 3 to 4 years. You're starting to see, you know, companies like Invitation Homes, which I believe is, I'm going to say it's BlackRock or Blackstone, one of the two of them. But you see that, you see a lot of people trying to make sort of national property management brands. You see those people more hesitant to move into Oregon, into Portland, just because of all this regulation. And so I think you see that from an investor side as well. I think also kind of gone are the days of being able to get a lot of single family homes at a, you know, fairly cheap price here. Obviously, we're a very mature market. We're sandwiched between, you know, two of the most expensive markets in the country, be that, you know, being Seattle and the Bay Area. So, you know, I think we have, you know, pretty high prices, especially for single family homes at this point. So it's not, you know, just in my experience in the world we operate in, we don't see a ton of investors operating at that level here.
Hi, with these so many restrictions, what are the positive points for investors to look for if they want to rent a property in Portland or in Oregon?
I mean, I think the positive side to it is that, you know, what it's really, it's changed a little bit, but I think it's still what it's always been, which is, number one, we have, you know, very strong rents, especially relative to what you see nationally. And historically, we have great appreciation. And I think that's really the name of the game for longer term investors here. You know, most of the people that we work with, they're obviously looking for positive cash flow, and they're looking for, you know, cap rates in the Portland area are around 4%. So, you know, folks are looking for, you know, a cap rate that's around that level, but then they're looking for something that's going to appreciate over the longer term. And I think that that's really, there's a lot of reasons. I mean, I think, you know, one of them is really, you know, geographically and specifically, you know, geologically, in that we're really, we don't have the ability to expand or, you know, and certainly not the political appetite to expand the urban growth boundary that you see in other places, like, you know, say Phoenix, for example, where you can just sort of keep building out. There's a lot of reasons that's not as possible in Portland. And so I think in, you know, the larger metro area. And so I think because of that, you'll see this continued, you know, certainly appreciation happening over time. So yeah, I mean, just from my perspective, all of this regulation, it's obviously a lot. There's some things here that are that seem onerous to investors, that can certainly turn off an individual from wanting to move into the market. But, you know, it's the world that we operate in, and it's, once you get into it, the reality is a lot of these issues really are at the beginning and at the end of tenancy, and when a property is being bought and sold. Once you have a rental that's up and running, it functions, largely the same it does anywhere else. And day to day, we're not navigating a ton of these regulations. And a lot of it is really baked into, again, how we're screening applicants, how we're processing security deposits, how we're navigating things when a property is being sold or if a tenant is being forced to move out. So all these types of things, and it does come into play. But by and large, I'm certainly still very positive on this area as a great rental market. I think we see very low, I think especially compared to other parts of the country, we see very low sort of late payment or non-payment of rents. We see, a really great class of folks that are renting, the types of properties that we manage. And in general, I'm very positive and bullish on the market, although we do have a lot of regulation that has to be navigated.
All right, Kurt, we have 5 minutes left in our meeting here, and we've got 2 questions that are on the chat. Jamethal is asking, if an applicant is rejected, are we required to tell them the reason for the rejection?
Yeah, so the way that this works is you are required to tell them why their application has been rejected. And then there's also a process if they challenge that or question that, there's then a process by which you have to provide them the opportunity to essentially provide supplemental information. The sort of kicker here specifically in Portland is that the regulation doesn't specify that you have to hold that rental property for that person. So it's really meant for, so when we manage a larger apartment complex, let's say we've got, a couple units available at once. One person is rejected for credit reasons. That's the most common one in our world, is they don't meet the credit score criteria. If they're rejected for that, they can question that. They can ask to provide supplemental information and say, hey, these are the reasons we think we should be reevaluated. We're not required to hold that unit for them. But then if they do come back, provide the supplemental information, we do qualify them, they are automatically approved for another unit. So if you own a single family home though, you can make sure you're following the letter of the law on this, and make sure if they are requesting this information or they are challenging it, you are following through with it. But you should also really understand the fine print of some of that regulation around whether you need to hold that unit for them or not. And typically you don't.
All right, and we have a question from Ryan, and I want to be a little bit careful with this question because I try to keep it strictly educational, but just in general, are you accepting new clients from people in the Hillsborough area?
Yeah, we are. Mm-hmm.
Okay. Ashish is asking, I'm curious to hear your take. Is an unintended side effect of all this rent control an increase in homelessness for people that are rejected as tenants?
Yeah, it's something that I think about a lot. And I think that everyone thinks about a lot in terms of what are the causes of homelessness. And I think if you think about it, you realize, oh, well, there's 5 to 10 sort of very kind of core reasons that play into that. I think that it possibly is an unintended consequence, though, of this regulation. I mean, we operate mostly in a market that's on the mid to high end of the market. So we're working with, single family homes that are typically, we've got houses that are, typically between $2,200 to, $7,500 a month in rent. We manage apartments that are, typically from, $1,200 to $2,200 a month in rent. So that's kind of the market that we operate in. So we're not operating in, what tradition would be called sort of, Class C type of properties. And I mean, not to sort of, I guess, say things in a very specific way, but, typically people who are going to be confronting homelessness are also then obviously confronting a lot of issues around, not having access to resources that would allow them to rent the types of properties that we are managing. So I can't speak to a lot of it directly, but I do think it is a real concern. And I think that it's certainly, all of this regulation hasn't led to a decrease in homelessness. And I don't think that it's had, I think one of the problems with some of this regulation is there's not a lot of follow through on the city's part to really track if this is working, and if not, why.
All right. Hey, everybody, could you take yourselves off of mute and thank Kurt Lane for coming in here and talking to us today?
Thank you.
Kurt.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kurt. This is great.
Thank you. Kurt.
Thank you, everyone. I
Thanks,
really
Daniel.
appreciate it.
Thank you, Kurt.
Nice work, Kurt.
Thank you. Thank you. Thanks, Kurt.
Thank you, Kurt. Thank you, Daniel.
All right. And just so everybody knows, this is our last meeting for the year. We're going to see you all again on the 6th, January 6th.
Happy New
Happy-
Year.
Happy New
and-
Year. Have a
Thank
great
you.
holiday.
Thank you. Happy holidays.
thanks,
Bye.